Thomas Jefferson came to the White House. Mr. Adams was the first to occupy it, but he was not there very long. He lost an election, a bitter election, to his former friend, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson came to the White House with very different ideas, not only about how the president should behave, but about architecture and philosophy. He had loved and revered Washington. He had been a close friend of Adams before this election, but he believed that as Federalists, they had behaved too much in an imperial way. They were too much like kings. They were too much like an emperor. Jefferson firmly believed that the president is simply the first citizen among many and should behave that way. So as you can see, here's what he said: "I hate protocol. It reeks of kings, and I hate the odor." Well, he insisted on living that way in a more casual way than former presidents, and that got him into some trouble because the British minister or ambassador had arrived in Washington and had an appointment to come with the Secretary of State to present his credentials to the president. This is a little meeting that is driven by protocol. It should happen in a certain way. Well, they arrived at the White House at the appointed time, where they happened to run into the president in the hallway, and the president was wearing his ratty dressing gown and his rundown slippers. And he said to the British ambassador, "Well, sir, since you're here, you might as well just present your credentials. Let's just do it here in the hallway," which he did. But the ambassador was hugely offended, not just for himself, but for his country. And he went back to his residence and wrote a letter home bitterly complaining about how poorly he had been treated by this upstart president. Who did he think he was to embarrass the minister of Great Britain? Things could have been smoothed over, but unfortunately they just got worse, because the president invited the ambassador, Mr. Mary, and his wife to dinner, and the Marys were under the mistaken idea that they were to be guests of honor and that the dinner was a kind of a makeup for the insult that had been offered to him. But this was not actually the case. They had just been invited to dinner. At the time, the tradition was that when all of the guests had assembled and were talking with the president, a servant would come in and announce dinner, and the president should take the arm of the lady with the highest precedence and walk her into dinner, and all of the other guests would walk along in an orderly way behind them, because they knew when they would get to the dinner table, there would be place settings, and everyone would sit in his or her order of precedence, and everyone, trust me, then and now, everyone in Washington knows exactly his or her place in the row of precedence. But Jefferson didn't do things that way. For Jefferson, when the servant came in and announced dinner, he would simply take the arm of the prettiest lady in the room and escort her into dinner, and all the other guests would have to scramble along behind, hoping that they'd get to the dining table in time to get a seat up close to the president, because that's, of course, where you wanted to be, to get to hear Thomas Jefferson speak about anything. The Marys, not knowing this, waited for him to take Mrs. Mary's arm. He didn't. Then they were left to scramble along behind, and they got a seat below the salt, well below their station in life, so they were even further insulted by this dinner. Eventually, the president's aides were able to persuade him that some forms of protocol and diplomacy actually smooth over relations, because that's really what it's designed to do. And he did adopt a slightly more formal attitude, but it was against his philosophy.